Being a gal throughout history was no walk in the park. As much as I fantasize about being medically prescribed a week of relaxation at an all-inclusive resort, I like having my rights more. Back in the 1800s, women weren't much more than property in a marriage, could literally be sold off, were shunned for working outside the home, and followed some life-threatening beauty trends, all of which we shall cover today. Question for you, what do you think was the worst part of the 1800s? Let me know in the comments and let's see if you're right. Wife selling in England was a way of ending an unsatisfactory marriage that began when divorce was a practical impossibility for all but the very wealthiest. So, after parading his wife with a halter around her neck, arm, or waist, a husband would publicly auction her to the highest bidder. Yeah, wives were sold by their husbands as recently as the 1800s. Technically, yes, this was the poor man's extrajudicial version of divorce, and it was a way for a man to avoid ending up in debtor's prison. The wife often had a buyer already lined up, and it was a way for the husband to save face if somebody else wanted his wife, and she wanted him. But it's still kind of weird in theory, and the whole practice is just kind of So although women had many moral obligations and duties in the home, church, and community, they had few political and legal rights in general. So when Abigail Adams reminded her husband, John, during the Constitutional Convention to remember the ladies, he was like, no sweetie. So women were pushed to the sidelines as dependents of men, without the power to bring suit, make contracts, own property, or vote. During the era of the cult of domestics, a woman was merely seen as a way of, well, enhancing the social status of her husband. So ultimately snubbed as a delegate to a World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, Elizabeth Cady Stanton returned to America in 1848 and organized the first convention for women's rights in Seneca Falls, New York. Under the leadership of Stanton, Mott, and Susan B. Anthony, the convention demanded improved laws regarding offspring custody, divorce, and property rights. They argued that women deserved equal wages and career opportunities in law, medicine, education, and the ministry. First and foremost amongst their demands was suffrage, the right to vote. So in the early 1800s, wives were property. They had no legal existence of their own. They could not enter into contracts, they couldn't write wills, and they had no legal recourse against cruel or violent husbands. Under the common law doctrine of coverture, a woman's property usually went to her husband with the whispering of, I do. The man assumed absolute ownership of his wife's personal property, and for all practical purposes, her real estate as well. He also gained control of any wages or other income accrued by his spouse. Technically, this meant that a man could do anything he wished with his wife's material possessions. He could sell them, give them away, or destroy them as he wanted. Now, married women were also forbidden to sell, give, or will any property. Awful. Giving birth at this time period was a difficult and sometimes dangerous experience for a woman. And by sometimes, I mean most times. Since the typical mother gave birth 5 to 8 times in her lifetime chances of dying during that process ran as high as 1 in 8. Death in this situation was pretty common because, well, things were dangerous. They were not good. And in addition to anxieties about pregnancy, an expectant mother was filled with apprehensions about, well, the death of what she gave birth to. In the healthiest communities, 1 birth in 10 I think died before the age of half a decade, and in less healthy environments, 3 folks in 10 died before reaching that age. In 1847, the pain-relieving and anesthetic properties of ether and chloroform were discovered and finally used in America for giving birth for the first time. So this began a whole new era in birth stuff. How so? Well, finally, mothers could be relieved of some pain during the process. So this discovery led to increasing medical dominance and just a lot of incredible discoveries. It also led to medical and moral controversy that had lasted for a long time. So on one hand, women were destined to suffer due to the curse of Eve and were expected to experience pain during the process. And if that sounds stupid, it is. Whereas on the other hand, humanitarians and the medical society believed that there were very good moral and technological reasons for controlling or eliminating pain. I don't ever plan on going through the process myself, but if I did, I know I'd want to be in the least amount of pain possible. Come on! While we're on the topic, here's something to chew on: the concept of voluntary motherhood. So attitudes about birth control were changing very rapidly during the 1800s. Early suffragists campaigned for voluntary motherhood during the 1870s. Now, the term voluntary motherhood refers to the right of a woman to refuse to have coitus in order to avoid pregnancy. However, at that time, women did not have the right to refuse intercourse with their husbands, and the culture dictated that they always had to be available to him. Later on, feminists demanded gender-specific parenting rights, challenging forced marital intercourse, involuntary motherhood, and parental custody and guardianship laws. They demanded unilateral control to the woman. voluntary motherhood, the right to choose when to procreate, the right to refuse coitus, and maternal custody presumptions were the rightful solutions to these issues. Because in parenting, the woman was the partner who had to bear the pregnancy and care for the result. So women that were forced into working situations outside of their households were kind of viewed negatively by society. Look, there was a lot of women then that needed to have an income to support their families because, well, the man in the household wasn't making enough money to survive. And when the woman entered the workplace, well, they were made to not feel welcome, and they were harassed. These women workers were therefore not welcome in the workplace, or, well, in society as a whole. Now, when you think about how most folks nowadays have multiple jobs and stay-at-home lifestyles only exist for the super rich, it's crazy to see how things have changed, but also how they haven't. In the 1800s, curly hair was popular. And early curling irons were tongs that needed to be heated in a fire, and if a woman pulled the curling iron out of the fire and applied it to her hair too quickly, it would be so hot that her hair would literally burn off. So as a result, baldness became a common problem for women in this era. Even if they became really skilled at curling their hair, it was still a lot of strain on the scalp to constantly style it in tight curls. Women didn't seem to put two and two together and tried multiple remedies of teas and medicines. It was even suggested that hair should be bathed with ammonia and water to stimulate growth. And exposure to ammonia can cause respiratory problems, burn the skin, and blindness. One expert suggested a mixture of equal parts sulfate and an aromatic tincture for baldness and loss of one's eyebrows in a fire. She also advised women to avoid having their curling tongs make direct contact with their hair, which a lot of folks didn't realize until it was too late. Now, in other popular hair trends, back to ammonia we go. It was a common ingredient in hair care and used for various purposes, including stimulating hair growth and getting rid of unwanted hair. Now, it was believed to have hair stimulating properties, but it could cause a lot of damage to the scalp and hair follicles. We're talking hair loss, scalp irritation, and yeah, respiratory problems. But despite the risks, women continued using ammonia-based hair products in their quest for luscious locks. I'm just gonna call this how to get pale fast. Because before the invention of fake bakes and spray tans, paleness was the must-have beauty trend. Yeah, in history, white skin was viewed as a sign of modesty and virtue. However, a pure white porcelain complexion is kind of impossible for somebody to attain naturally. So a lot of women went to extreme lengths to whiten their skin and attain that highly sought after virtuous look. So redletting was the practice of making a small incision in somebody's arm, and then you'd give them a pull to squeeze until a sufficient amount of fluid had spilled out. And then you'd collect that in a bowl. And look, if you remove enough, redness from somebody, they're gonna look kind of pale. They're gonna look kind of sickly. That's kind of what you want them to look like. In this situation, well, that's what you want it to look like. Don't worry, your body's gonna regenerate some fresh redness and then you're good to go. This was one of the most popular methods for fashion purposes. Also, if you didn't want to do it that way, you could just apply a little fluid-sucking leech to behind your ear, and then it would drain your redness in a controlled fashion. And thus, color from the face. Goodbye. First introduced to England by France's Empress Eugenie in the late 1850s, the cage crinoline signaled a new era in fashion, reaching peak popularity and peak circumference in the early 1860s. Now, while the garment has often been understood as a symbol of a repressive patriarchal order intent on confining women, contemporary reporting shows that it was actually regarded as a potentially threatening tool of emancipation. Look at it. It replaced layers of heavy petticoats with a light and flexible alternative, offering women greater mobility and comfort. And the proportions of the skirts kind of, got rid of the need for tight-laced corsets. What is more, donning crinoline allowed women to assert physical space in the public sphere, their voluminous skirts forcing men to the margins of the sidewalk. Or, get out of here. Now, perhaps the most incredible quality of the crinoline was its potential to hide things from the male gaze. Bad angles, smuggled goods, you could hide them under the cage. But the risk of concealed pregnancy kind of loomed largest. Now, reports of death by crinoline fire were kind of matched in their fevered pitch by warnings that crinoline sharply increased rates of loss of birth. Now, the range of Victorian responses that accrued around the fashion demonstrates that it was not simply a tool for oppression or vanity, but I'm still gonna be thinking about that fire problem. And finally for today, Southern women in rural areas grappled with entirely different concerns. The death of suitable men, or well, lack of men at all. By the summer of 1963 in North Carolina, only 20 of the 250 folks remaining in town were men. The war was on its way to claiming 1 in 5 white Southern men of military age, leaving behind more than 70,000 widows. Widowed women in their 30s faced stiff competition for available men in their age group, and suffered constant reminders of their grim odds. The editor of the Petersburg Daily Register took pity on older eligible women during the social season of 1864, helpfully warning them against using rouge. They were like, bachelors are a shy game, and when convinced of one deception, imagine many more. As if strategizing over how to thwart younger rivals wasn't taxing enough, the widows were also national laughingstocks. punchlines to the endless, old-maid jokes that became a staple of American humor. Well, as time passed and casualties mounted, some women grew resigned to the idea of life without a husband, while others compromised on acceptable partners. One looks at a man so differently when you think he may be killed tomorrow. This was the musings of one South Carolina woman. Men whom up to this time I thought dull and commonplace seemed charming. Well, 1 in 13 soldiers returned home missing limbs, and the press, pulpit, and politicians reminded Southern women that it was their patriotic duty to marry disabled veterans. Yeah, that was verbatim. And that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.